Chapter 10. Lost in the brilliant display of colors below the balcony, Ayianna allowed her thoughts to drift. Her grief dulled. Beneath her, a procession of jugglers staggered past. Knives and flaming torches spun in the air around them. Two of them opened their mouths and spewed fire. A tumult of shrieks and laughter echoed off the buildings as the onlookers below exploded in applause. The third-floor patio was the best way to see the parade, Desmond had insisted. Why would anyone want to be down in the streets? Except for Ayianna, that is. Her first time in Badera, the city of the king, and here she was locked away in an inn. A giant creature swayed under her perch. He was so big she could almost reach over the railing and touch his wrinkly skin. Two long ivory tusks protruded from the sides of his mouth, and another pair curled out above his temples like horns. A long, flexible trunk swung from the animal's face and hoisted a bright orange and blue banner. Alentanili of the Paladin, a voice behind her said. Ayianna jumped. She turned around and sucked in her breath. Kale stood beneath the archway leading to the balcony. Cleaned up and dressed in traditional elven attire, he looked every bit an elf, perhaps a vision of her father in his younger years. Grief wrenched her heart. She averted her eyes. She couldn't help but think the white embroidery lining the slate-blue tunic seemed out of place on Kale, despite the fact he was an elf. Maybe it was the scar across his brow, or the small gold earring. More likely, it was his behavior she hadn't expected from one who hailed from a race who valued courteous and graceful conduct. "Forgive me for intruding," he said as he touched his fingertips together in the traditional elven greeting and bowed. "You shouldn't creep up on people like that." She looked away and exhaled her frustration. "And you should be more aware of your surroundings." She pulled her scarf around her head tighter. "Are you still here?" "Enjoying the parade?" He stepped out onto the balcony next to her. She slid away from him. "I was until you showed up." "Where is Liam?" "In the room." "And Desmond?" "Busy." She focused on the acrobats bouncing down the street after the parade. Civilians and foreigners alike poured out into the cobbled streets and followed the parade as it disappeared around a corner. The festival would finish with spectacular shows and a gigantic feast, and she wouldn't be able to see any of it. She tried to hide her disappointment. "The rest of the festival is held in the inner courtyard." He twisted his hands around the polished wood railing. "You're welcome to join me, unless you're content with staring at the dirty streets below." Ayianna's breath caught. Had he read her mind? She fished in her pocket for her talisman, but then chided herself. Elves don't read minds. "You know," he faced her and leaned against the wood, "a talisman only works when you wear it around your neck." Ayianna spun around. "How did you know? Besides, talismans and amulets and other protective charms are for lazy people and scheming peddlers wanting to make a quick fortune. You can learn to guard your thoughts without their use." Ayianna stared at him. She wasn't sure if she was more upset that he could somehow read her mind or the fact that he had just called her lazy. "Why are you here?" she asked, finally finding her voice. "I was just passing by and saw you, so I thought I'd say hello, seeing how we didn't meet on the best of terms, or parted on them either." He pulled his eyes from the street and met hers. "And I would like to thank you for cleaning up my arm." "It was nothing. How could she be so ungrateful?" She met his gaze. "You saved my life. It was the least I could do. I guess we're even then." "Not quite, unless you call a life and an arm a fair trade." He cocked an eyebrow. She shook her head. "I guess not. Are you interested in seeing more of the festival?" Ayianna glanced away. The ruckus of horns and voices had faded. A faint melody drifted down the deserted streets. "I shouldn't." "Of course, I understand," he said. "When are you going home?" "I have to wait for Desmond to finish up his business here." She leaned forward on the railing. "About a week." "A week?" Kale touched her shoulder. "Your mother will be worried sick." Her ache deepened at his touch. She blinked back the tears and straightened. "I have no choice." He stood next to her, the silence growing longer. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Well, He eyed her, his expression unreadable, but his gray eyes darkened. "I guess this is goodbye then." He turned to leave. "Wait!" Ayianna faced him. "Did Saeed meet with the king yet?" No, the king isn't seeing anyone right now. Saeed is furious. How can the king not be concerned what happened at Dagmar? He shrugged. Dagmar is considered outside of his jurisdiction. But what about the men that murdered my father? We are under Ramiro's lordship, thus under the king's jurisdiction. The king isn't going to bother with a mere peasant's death. Ayianna gaped at him. How could he be so irritating? I didn't mean, he frowned and crossed his arms. I meant that is how he views it. What about Saeed? He leaned against the archway. He doesn't have much to go on. Have you remembered anything else about the incident? I've been trying to forget it. I'm meeting Saeed in a while. I could take you to him. Ayianna looked down the street. Did her brother's death make her message obsolete? If Saeed knew her father was a secret keeper, then perhaps her father's death would be honored and some sort of justice brought about. She pursed her lips. How angry would Desmond be if she went? But if she was back before he was, there would be no need for him to know. She had to do it for her father. A handful of women swirled in the center of the courtyard to a lilting tune of horns and lutes as Ayianna followed Kale through the throng, enjoying the show. She clutched the carved talisman, hoping to ease the nerves twisting her stomach. She scanned the sea of turned heads and swinging hips for Desmond. Would he even be among the celebrants? Without a glimpse of her betrothed, Ayianna tightened her head covering and hurried after Kale. Was she doing the right thing? Maybe she should turn back before Desmond caught her. No, she had to talk to Saeed. Desmond would understand. He'd have to. The aroma of smoked turkey legs and cinnamon buns hung heavy in the air, and her stomach growled, scolding her for missing the afternoon meal. She couldn't let that distract her. She'd eat, once she had talked to Saeed. But what was she going to tell him? Her father had been a secret keeper? But of what? Maybe Saeed wouldn't believe her, or wouldn't be able to help, and she would have risked the scorn of her future husband for nothing. Kale and Ayianna skirted the edge of the courtyard, where large fountains and green shrubbery made a circular pattern. Kale had explained that it was built to confuse the king's enemies and slow their progress towards the great hall. Ayianna thought she'd be sick if they didn't reach the inner courtyard soon. Apart from the dizzying path, the clipped hedges towered over her and cast the afternoon in shadows. No entrance or exit in sight, just rows and rows of leafy bushes. Had anyone lost their way in the maze? Did Kale know where he was going? But before panic could grip her, the stone path ended. The inner courtyard sprawled beneath them, hemmed in by a second curtain wall and steep sides of the great castle of Badara. Below, the dancers gyrated, and the chaotic multitude broke into applause. Angular towers crowned with crenellations rose behind them to varying heights and surrounded the king's keep. Mounted above the towers, a green and gold banner flashed in the afternoon sun. Ayianna couldn't help but notice the difference between the sharp angles of Badara and the sweeping curves of Zuriel. A twinge of longing for her childhood home swept through her, but she quickly brushed it aside. Kale pressed on through the packed courtyard toward the great hall. Ayianna did her best to keep up, but only managed to fall farther behind. The boisterous assembly writhed with laughter, spilling ale from their mugs. They didn't care if they bumped into her or sprayed her with the nauseating drink. She looked for Kale, but he was gone. She called for him, but her voice was drowned amidst the clamor of instrument and voices. A shiver raced down her spine. How could she have lost him? The music changed to a soft, luring melody and drew her attention back toward the center stage. The people stilled as the dancers began to sing, their voices fluid and hypnotic. Words twined with the lute's gentle rhythmic strums. Ayianna didn't recognize the language, but she understood its power. The song tugged at her, calling to her grief-stricken heart. It breathed of peace and freedom. The crowd surged forward and swept her along like a leaf in a stream. The dancers, with their colorful silk scarves and dresses, flickered between the bobbing of heads. The song, like a balm, soothed her sorrowful heart. Doubt and worry disappeared. A hand grabbed her and she flinched. She didn't want to be stopped. She needed to see the dancers. She jerked her arm free and plunged forward, pushing through the men and women. Where was the peace the song promised? Bodies jostled against her, pushing her back, muffling the strains of the melody. Hands grasped her shoulders and spun her around. She yelped. Balling her hands into a fist, she swung, but her aim was poor. A flash of slate blue blocked her blow. It took a moment for her to recognize Kale's icy glare. "What are you thinking?" His grip tightened on her shoulders. Her gaze broke from hers and swept across the area. "You nearly gouged my eye out." "What were you thinking, grabbing me like that?" She eyed his hardened expression. "Is there something wrong?" His jaw tightened. His gray eyes darkened. "Stay close. I'm certain Desmond wouldn't approve if I lost you." She planted her hands on her hips. "And he wouldn't approve of you being with me either. But that didn't stop you, did it?" "Nor did it stop you." She glared at him, but the song called to her, and she turned away in search of the dancers. Now she was even farther away, standing on the outskirts of the crowd next to one of the fountains. She flung her hands up. What a fool of an elf he was! "O de lusa usana leta tanio. Eja o nuyotu sa usana leta tuanio. Rusa za tuiso ko tuyo theo niña isu." Strong arms seized her from behind and shoved her into the pool of water. Ayianna kicked and thrashed, but she couldn't break free. Finally, the grip gave way, and she resurfaced, sputtering and coughing out water. She spun to face her attacker. Kale. He stood next to her, drenched. "You!" Ayianna balled her fists. "What are you doing?" Kale wiped the water from his eyes and squeezed his hair dry. "I saved your life." "By trying to drown me?" she asked, but her words were lost in cheers and clapping, the uproar near deafening. "Keep your voice down," his brow tightened. He glanced away and scanned the area. "As if they could hear me." He glared at her. "That was a spell. I'm sure of it." "Really?" She drew up her waterlogged dress and waded toward the edge. "Next time you'll say we're all under attack and you'll try to drown me again." Kale offered to help her out, but she shoved his hand away. She dragged herself out of the pool and did her best to wring out her dress. She faced him and opened her mouth to unleash an angry tirade, but stopped. Everyone had grown silent. "Are you all right?" He climbed out of the pool. "I am soaking wet. What do you think?" "A little water never hurt anyone." He shook his shirt out and tried to press the water from his pants legs. Ayianna shook her head. "You were trying to drown me." "I wasn't. Listen. If that was a spell, and I think it was, you would have been cursed or something worse. The water blocked the spell. If I'm wrong, we're just wet. But if I'm right, then I protected you." "You think?" Ayianna stood on tiptoe, trying to peer over in between the shoulders. The people stared ahead, mesmerizing and unmoving. Why had everyone gone silent? "How do you know so much about spells?" "Keep your voice down," he whispered harshly and grasped her arm. "Get away from me." She shoved him aside and pushed through the bodies. This time, they didn't push her back. What was going on? She came upon an opening between a plump older man and his shorter companion, a woman wrapped in a purple head covering and a lavender dress. Ahead, she caught flicker of colorful scarves. The dancers! "Lord Whiston!" someone announced. Male or female, she couldn't tell. A man, arrayed in Badera's green and gold, joined the women. One of them removed a silver cup from between the prongs of the ornate staff and presented it to him. "Citizens of Badara!" the man exclaimed, holding the silver cup high. "A cup of ale for all!" The crowd erupted again with cheers and applause. "Let the feast begin!" "Ayianna, you are not yourself." Kale's voice sounded distant. "It's the spell." What did he know? She clenched her teeth. Why did he irritate her so? She wove her way between the stiff humans. She had to meet the dancers. They had to sing again. Maybe she could make a special request, if she could ever reach them. The crowd shifted and the stage they had been dancing on came into view. But there were no dancers. Her heart sank. Kale touched her shoulder. "What?" She pulled her attention from the empty stage and glanced up at Kale. His gray eyes were as cold as ice. "We need to go." She frowned. "No, I am done with you. If Saeed still wants to see me, he can come by the inn and make arrangements with Desmond. This is ridiculous." Ayianna shook her head and shoved past him. What was she thinking? She had to get back and cleaned up before Desmond returned. She gritted her teeth and entered the winding bushes.